The quiet hum of the space station was all John could hear as the janitor of the station. His life was routine, dull, and filled with little more than sweeping, mopping, and scrubbing floors. But today, something felt different. His eyes kept darting to the massive glass window overlooking the stars. The hum had been replaced with a slight vibration in the floor. Something bigger was coming. He wasn't a fighter, never had been, but this wasn't just any day. Suddenly, the doors to the central corridor burst open. The ground shook as a group of armored soldiers stormed in. At the front, a figure loomed tall and powerful, dressed in an imposing black uniform adorned with insignia no one had ever dared challenge. The Intergalactic General, a feared warlord known for conquering whole planets without lifting a finger. The soldiers moved with military precision, making their way towards the command center. John froze, his mop still in hand. The general's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on him. There was no mistaking it. John felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. Even though no one knew who he was, no one would ever suspect him as anything more than the humble janitor, cleaning up after others' messes. But today, the universe was about to change. Without thinking, John took a step forward. His heart raced, but a surge of courage he didn't understand began to rise in him. Something deep within told him it was his time, his moment to act. He had no weapons. He had no armor. But he had one thing no one else in the room had: sheer, unrelenting determination. The general barked an order, and the soldiers immediately turned toward the station's control systems. They had no reason to suspect the janitor would be a threat. But John wasn't thinking about the control systems, the weapons, or even the soldiers. He was thinking about something else, something far more important. As the general's back turned, John saw his opportunity. Time seemed to slow as he stepped forward, his mop gripped tightly like a weapon. The general was a giant, no doubt. His reputation was built on strength and fear. But John, in that moment, felt a strange connection with his surroundings. With no further hesitation, he took action. In a swift motion, John closed the distance between them. His body moved with instincts honed from years of physical labor and the quiet yet fierce drive that had always burned within him. He grabbed the general by the shoulders, and without thinking he lifted him off the ground, using his mop as a lever. And then, just like that, he suplexed the Intergalactic General. The station fell silent. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with disbelief. The general, who had never been challenged in his life, lay on the ground, stunned. John stood above him, breathless but standing tall. He was still just the janitor, but now he was something more. The room was deathly silent. The soldiers stood frozen, staring at their general, who was now lying sprawled on the cold metal floor. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had done it, but he didn't know what to do next. The mop in his hands felt heavier now, like the weight of a weapon that could change the fate of the entire station. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The general groaned, shaking his head as he struggled to rise. His armor clanged as it scraped against the floor. His face twisted in fury. He had never been defeated. No one had ever dared challenge him, let alone throw him down. His pride, like his reputation, was shattered in an instant. The soldier's hesitation lasted only a moment. The first one to react raised a blaster, aiming it directly at John. "Move," the soldier barked, his voice shaky but authoritative. The others followed suit, their weapons now pointed at the humble janitor. They had been trained to kill without hesitation, but something about John's calm demeanor threw them off. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a fighter. And yet, he had just defeated the most powerful warrior in the galaxy. John's fingers tightened around the mop. He had no weapons, no training, and no plan. But for some reason, he didn't feel fear. He felt ready. There was something deep inside him that had been unlocked the moment he had lifted the general. Something primal, something powerful. He didn't know it yet, but the universe was about to change for him and for everyone around him. "You think you can stop me with that?" The general's voice was a low growl as he finally pushed himself to his feet. His eyes burned with anger. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." The soldier stood still, waiting for orders. John didn't wait. He lunged forward, his mop held high. Without a second thought, he swung the mop with all his strength, knocking the first soldier's blaster out of his hand. The soldier stumbled back in shock, and John didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the next soldier, sweeping his legs out from under him with a powerful strike of the mop. "Stop him!" the general roared. But it was too late. The soldiers were in disarray. They had never expected this. A janitor, a mere cleaner, was taking them down one by one. The general, his face contorted with rage, charged forward, drawing a sharp blade from his side. John had no formal combat training, but he knew how to move. As the general swung the blade, John ducked under it, his mop now a makeshift shield. His foot shot out, tripping the general, and for a brief second, he was on top of him again. The general snarled, grabbing John by the arm and throwing him across the room. John hit the wall with a thud, his breath knocked out of him. But as he lay there, gasping for air, he felt something new stirring within him. He had never fought like this before, but it felt natural, effortless even. The general's soldiers stood at the ready, unsure if they should advance. They had seen their commander struggle against a mere janitor, and it had shaken them. The general, now on his feet again, roared in fury and raised his blade. But it wasn't fear that gripped John, it was determination. He knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them win. With renewed strength, John sprang to his feet, his movements now more fluid, more instinctive. The mop was still in his hands, but it had transformed. It wasn't just a cleaning tool anymore. It was his weapon. It was all he had, and with it, he was going to prove that he wasn't just a janitor. This part continues John's unexpected rise and shows him adapting to a dangerous situation. It sets up a battle between him and the soldiers, as well as his internal transformation. Let me know if you need any adjustments or further developments. The chaos in the room reached a fever pitch. The general's soldiers hesitated, their weapons trained on John, but no one dared to make the first move. The air was thick with tension as John stood there, holding his mop like a battle axe, his chest heaving with each breath. He had no formal training, no weapons, but in that moment, he felt more powerful than he ever had in his entire life. The general's fury knew no bounds. He roared in frustration, and his soldiers tightened their grips on their blasters. "Get him! Don't let that filthy janitor stand in our way," the general shouted. John's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything had already changed. He had discovered something deep within himself, a well of strength, focus, and resolve that he never knew existed. The mop, once just a tool for cleaning, now felt like an extension of his own will. It was his lifeline, his only defense. Without warning, one of the soldiers lunged at him, blaster raised high. John reacted instinctively. He sidestepped, swinging the mop with a fluid motion that knocked the blaster from the soldier's hand. The soldier stumbled, and John took advantage of the moment. He drove his elbow into the soldier's chest, sending him crashing to the floor. The general's eyes widened. He had underestimated John, just like the soldiers had. They had all seen him as nothing more than a janitor, someone they could ignore, someone they could crush. But now, as John stood over the fallen soldier, a sense of realization began to spread across the room. The janitor wasn't just a lowly worker. He was a force to be reckoned with. "You're a fool." The general's voice was cold, filled with disgust. He swung his blade once again, aiming for John's neck, but John was ready. He ducked just in time, feeling the whoosh of air as the blade missed him by inches. His feet moved instinctively, his body swaying with the rhythm of battle. He had no strategy, no plan, but in that moment, he realized he didn't need one. He just needed to move. With a quick spin, John swept the mop across the floor, tripping the general. The mighty warrior fell to the ground, his armor clanging with a loud thud. The soldiers gasped, and for a split second, the general's fierce exterior cracked. He was vulnerable, and they all saw it. John wasn't done yet. He moved it fast, his mop coming down with a precise strike that knocked the general's blade from his hand. The general's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and surprise. "You dare?" he snarled. The soldier stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. The battle was no longer just about fighting, it was about survival. The janitor had shown them something they had never expected. He wasn't just a janitor. He was someone who had defied the odds, someone who had dared to challenge the most feared being in the galaxy. The general scrambled to his feet, his anger now boiling over. He was used to being in control, to dominating everyone around him, but John had disrupted that, and the general wasn't about to let some janitor, some nobody steal his power. "You'll regret this," the general growled. He lunged at John. Once more, fury in his eyes. But John was ready. He took a deep breath, his instincts kicking in. As the general charged, John sidestepped again, but this time, he wasn't just avoiding the strike. He was anticipating it. With lightning speed, John grabbed the general by the wrist and twisted, pulling the general's arm behind his back. The mighty warrior grunted in pain, but John didn't let go. The soldiers gasped again. The janitor had the general in a hold, a move no one expected from someone who had never been in a fight. Yield, John said, his voice calm but firm. He was still holding the general's arm behind his back, and the power dynamic had completely shifted. The soldiers were no longer sure of their position. The general, the feared warrior, was now at the mercy of the janitor. The room was silent. The tension hung thick in the air as the general struggled. You think you've won? He spat. You are nothing compared to me. John's grip tightened, and he leaned in closer, his face inches from the general's. I'm not here to prove anything to you, he said. I'm here to survive. It was the truth. John wasn't trying to conquer the universe. He wasn't seeking glory or fame. He was just a man who had been thrown into an impossible situation, and he was going to make sure he survived it no matter the cost. John stood over the general, his arms still locked in a painful twist. The soldiers had been silent for far too long, watching in stunned disbelief as the janitor held their leader hostage. For years, they had followed the general without question. He was invincible, unchallenged, a god to them, and yet, here they were, watching him at the mercy of a man who only moments ago had been cleaning their floors. The general's breathing was labored, his pride shattered. He had never been in a position like this. To be beaten by a janitor, a mere worker, was unthinkable. The soldiers' hesitation was palpable. They had trained their entire lives for combat, yet they stood frozen, unwilling to make the first move against John. The fear in their eyes was real. Get him off me, the general spat, but his voice held no authority now. The same man who once commanded fleets of starships and had struck fear into the hearts of entire civilizations was now reduced to a broken warrior pleading for mercy. John could feel the power in his hands, the power of control, the power of defiance. He wasn't some helpless bystander anymore. His body felt alive with the adrenaline coursing through him. He wasn't thinking about the mob or the soldiers or the general. He was thinking about his survival, his freedom, and if he had to fight to the bitter end, then so be it. You have to do better than that, John said, his voice calm but firm. He twisted the general's arm a little more, making the warrior wince. I'll kill you, the general growled, trying to gather some strength to fight back. His eyes were filled with rage, but John didn't let him. With one last, painful twist, John shoved the general to the ground, causing the mighty warrior to fall flat on his back. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the room. The general tried to get up, but John was already moving again, keeping him off balance, not giving him the chance to regain control. You won't win, the general muttered, trying to pull himself up. He wasn't done, not yet, but his arrogance had already cost him. The soldiers had witnessed his fall, and it was clear to them that he wasn't as invincible as they thought. John was no longer fighting for pride. He was fighting for something deeper now, his own humanity, his right to exist without fear. The years of being overlooked, being underestimated, all of it had led to this moment. It wasn't about the mop anymore. It wasn't about the station. It was about proving to himself that he was worth something. One of the soldiers, the most hesitant of the group, took a small step forward, his weapon still aimed at John. We don't have to do this, the soldier said, his voice shaky. You can surrender. We'll let you go. John's eyes locked with the soldiers. For a second, he saw the uncertainty in the soldier's eyes. A man who had been taught to kill, but didn't know why. A man who had followed orders without ever questioning them. No, John said, his voice steady. I won't surrender. Not to him. The general growled, his fury rising again. You're making a mistake. Do you have any idea who I am? What I've done? I've conquered entire systems, wiped out civilizations. You're nothing. John stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You've conquered people who never stood a chance, he said. You've destroyed those who couldn't fight back. But I'm not one of them. The general lunged forward again, desperate to prove that he still had the upper hand. His blade flashed, cutting through the air with deadly precision. But John was faster. With a swift movement, He sidestepped the attack and disarmed the general, knocking the blade out of his hand. The soldiers flinched. This time, there was no mistaking it. John wasn't just a janitor. He was a fighter, a survivor. "I told you," John said, standing tall over the fallen general. "I'm here to survive, and I'm not leaving without doing that." The general, now panting on the ground, glared up at John with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He had never been brought down so easily before, never so humiliated. "You'll regret this. You'll regret everything you've done." But John wasn't listening. He wasn't concerned with revenge or petty threats. He was concerned with his future, and in that future, the general and his soldiers had no place. John turned to face the soldiers, his grip still tight on his mop. "You can leave now," he said, his voice cold, "or you can stay and try to fight. The choice is yours." For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers, seeing their commander defeated, slowly lowered their weapons. It was over. The janitor had won. The air was thick with uncertainty. John stood, his mop still gripped tightly in his hand, his eyes scanning the room. The soldiers, who moments ago had been poised to kill him, now hesitated, their weapons lowered. The general, still sprawled on the ground, glared up at him with a venomous gaze, but there was no more power in that look. He had been dethroned, humiliated by someone he had once considered beneath him. John took a deep breath, his body sore from the fight, but his mind clearer than ever. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something beyond the walls of this station. He was fighting for dignity, for respect, and for the right to decide his own fate. The general slowly pushed himself up, his once imposing frame now sagging under the weight of his defeat. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, wiping blood from his lip. "This isn't over. You may have bested me, but there are others. There are always others." John didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in fighting your battles, but I will fight my own." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. John could see the internal struggle written across their faces. They had spent their lives serving under the general, living in his shadow. Now, they were faced with a man who had single-handedly brought down their leader. The chain of command had been broken, and they were left with a choice: follow the general into further violence or walk away. "You're free to go," John said, his voice steady. "I won't stop you, but if you choose to stay, know this: there's no going back." For a moment, everything was still. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the space station's engines. John knew the general's soldiers had been conditioned to obey without question, to follow their orders without hesitation, but now they were questioning everything. Their loyalty to a man who had once been untouchable was crumbling before their eyes. The first soldier to lower his weapon completely was the one who had hesitated the most. His face was full of doubt, but in that moment, he made a decision. Slowly, he turned and walked away. The other soldiers followed suit, their steps unsure but steady, their weapons now holstered. John's eyes never left the general, who was still on the floor, seething in fury. The soldiers had abandoned him, and there was nothing left for him. Here, the tide had turned, but the general wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "You think they're going to let you live after this?" The general spat. "I'll have you killed before the day's out. You're nothing but a dead man walking." John stepped forward, his gaze never wavering. He was calm now, no longer the frightened janitor who had stumbled into this war. He was a man who had survived against all odds, and he knew that he was no longer afraid of the general or anyone else. "You're wrong," John said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not a dead man. I'm the one who decides what happens next." The general's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, John thought the warrior might charge at him once more. But then the general seemed to deflate, realizing he had no more fight left in him. His soldiers were gone, his reputation shattered. His future was uncertain, and he knew it. There was no coming back from this. John wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't a soldier, and he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But he had done something that no one, not even the general, thought possible. He had fought for himself and won. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he had control over his life. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He wasn't just a worker who cleaned up after others. He was a man who had taken his fate into his own hands. "Get out," John said, his voice low but powerful, "and take your army with you. I'm done with you." The general glared at him one last time, but then, with a slow, deliberate movement. He stood up and turned to leave. His once proud posture was now bent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The general, once a titan of war, was reduced to nothing, more than a broken man. As the general exited the room, John stood alone. The space station was silent once more. He had no idea what would come next. The universe wasn't going to change overnight, but for the first time, he felt like he had the power to make his own decisions. The mop was still in his hand, but it no longer felt like a weapon. It was just a tool, and he was done cleaning up after others. The quiet that had followed the general's departure seemed endless. John stood alone in the vast, empty hall of the station. The hum of machinery was all he could hear. The sound of something that had once been just background noise, now strangely comforting. He had done it. He had defeated the most feared warrior in the galaxy. But what came next? The soldiers were gone, their departure marking the end of a war John had never expected to be part of. They hadn't just left him, they had left the general, abandoning the man who had led them with an iron fist. John knew that he would never be able to erase the feeling of their eyes on him, their doubts, their disbelief, but he had proven something to them, to himself, and that was enough. But now, John faced an uncertain future. The space station, once just a place for him to clean and serve, had become the battleground for his survival. His victory over the general had made him something different, something more, but it had also made him a target. The general had powerful allies, people who would seek revenge, who would stop at nothing to restore the general's power. John knew he couldn't stay here forever. He had proven his point, but there was no future for him on this station. His past life as a janitor was gone, erased the moment he lifted the general off the ground and suplexed him. But what now? What did a man like him do after he had already done the impossible? As if reading his thoughts, the station's communication system flickered to life. A voice crackled over the speakers, breaking the silence. It was a calm, measured voice, one that John had heard before. It was Captain Alara, the leader of the station's remaining crew. "John, this is Captain Alara. I've seen what you've done, and I think it's time we have a talk." John's heart skipped a beat. A talk with the captain? He hadn't expected anyone to be left, much less someone of Alara's rank. He activated the intercom, his voice low but steady. "I'm listening." "Captain," the speaker buzzed for a moment, then Alara's voice came through clearly. "I've been monitoring the situation from the command center. You've made a lot of enemies today, but you've also earned my respect. The general's power is broken, but there are others who will seek revenge, and I'm afraid you won't be able to fight them all alone." John thought for a moment. "I didn't start this fight," he said, his voice tainted with weariness, "but I'll finish it if I have to." "You don't have to do it alone," Alara replied. "I've seen what you're capable of. We're not a military force, but we're resourceful. If you'll let us, we'll help you take the fight. To whoever's coming next, you don't need to do this by yourself." John hesitated. He had spent his whole life fighting alone, first in his lonely job as a janitor, and then in his fight for survival against the general. But something about Alara's words struck him. Maybe he didn't have to keep fighting alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could build something from this. "Ow, think about it," John said, glancing out the window once more. The stars were distant, cold, and indifferent to the struggles of those on the station below. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to be a janitor anymore. He was going to take control of his life. No more hiding in the shadows. "You've got a lot of people who owe you now, John." Alara's voice echoed in the speakers again. "But be warned, the road ahead is dangerous. You've made an enemy of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, and they won't forget what you did." "I don't care," John muttered to himself, the fire inside him burning brighter than ever. "I'm done running." The quiet that had followed the general's departure seemed endless. John stood alone in the vast, empty hall of the station. The hum of machinery was all he could hear. The sound of something that had once been just background noise, now strangely comforting. He had done it. He had defeated the most feared warrior in the galaxy. But what came next? The soldiers were gone, their departure marking the end of a war John had never expected to be part of. They hadn't just left him, they had left the general, abandoning the man who had led them with an iron fist. John knew that he would never be able to erase the feeling of their eyes on him, their doubts, their disbelief, but he had proven something to them, to himself, and that was enough. But now, John faced an uncertain future. The space station, once just a place for him to clean and serve, had become the battleground for his survival. His victory over the general had made him something different, something more, but it had also made him a target. The general had powerful allies, people who would seek revenge, who would stop at nothing to restore the general's power. John knew he couldn't stay here forever. He had proven his point, but there was no future for him on this station. His past life as a janitor was gone, erased the moment he lifted the general off the ground and suplexed him. But what now? What did a man like him do after he had already done the impossible? As if reading his thoughts, the station's communication system flickered to life. A voice crackled over the speakers, breaking the silence. It was a calm, measured voice, one that John had heard before. It was Captain Alara, the leader of the station's remaining crew. "John, this is Captain Alara. I've seen what you've done, and I think it's time we have a talk." John's heart skipped a beat. A talk with the captain? He hadn't expected anyone to be left, much less someone of Alara's rank. He activated the intercom, his voice low but steady. "I'm listening." "Captain," the speaker buzzed for a moment. Then Alara's voice came through clearly. "I've been monitoring the situation from the command center. You've made a lot of enemies today, but you've also earned my respect. The general's power is broken, but there are others who will seek revenge, and I'm afraid you won't be able to fight them all alone." John thought for a moment. "I didn't start this fight," he said, his voice tainted with weariness. "But I'll finish it if I have to." "You don't have to do it alone," Alara replied. "I've seen what you're capable of. We're not a military force, but we're resourceful. If you'll let us, we'll help you take the fight. To whoever's coming next, you don't need to do this by yourself." John hesitated. He had spent his whole life fighting alone, first in his lonely job as a janitor, and then in his fight for survival against the general. But something about Alara's words struck him. Maybe he didn't have to keep fighting alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could build something from this. "Ow, think about it," John said, glancing out the window once more. The stars were distant, cold, and indifferent to the struggles of those on the station below. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to be a janitor anymore. He was going to take control of his life. No more hiding in the shadows. "You've got a lot of people who owe you now, John." Alara's voice echoed in the speakers again. "But be warned, the road ahead is dangerous. You've made an enemy of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, and they won't forget what you did." "I don't care," John muttered to himself, the fire inside him burning brighter than ever. "I'm done running.